My name is Claire Thompson. I'm 26 years old, and 5 years ago, my boyfriend Matt thought it would be funny to drive off and leave me stranded at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. Everyone laughed at the story he told later. His friends, our mutual friends, even people who barely knew us. Everyone but me. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't beg him to come back. I didn't flood his phone with angry calls. I simply walked away from the car, from him, and from the life I thought I had. That single decision, made under the humming fluorescent lights of a lonely gas station, was the beginning of everything. They thought they were telling a story about a joke. They didn't realize they were writing the first chapter of my real life. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment on where you are watching from. The weekend had been Matt's idea from the start. A 3-day music festival 2 states over. A last-minute road trip with his 2 closest friends, Kevin and Sarah. He'd presented it to me as a grand romantic gesture, a final burst of summer freedom before the fall semester began. "It'll be amazing, Claire," he'd said, his arms wrapped around me, his voice full of that infectious excitement that always made me push my own doubts aside. I wasn't a huge fan of camping or massive crowds, but I loved the way his eyes lit up when he was planning an adventure. Saying yes felt like saying yes to him, to us. The reality of the festival was less romantic. It was muddy, loud, and overwhelmingly crowded. Matt was in his element, a social butterfly flitting between groups, a can of cheap beer always in his hand. He loved being the center of attention, and a festival was the perfect stage. I, on the other hand, felt small and out of place. While he, Kevin, and Sarah seemed to thrive on the chaos, I found myself retreating, seeking out quieter spots on the periphery. This was a common dynamic for us. Matt was the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit, constantly trying to keep up with his blazing energy. There were small, sharp moments throughout the weekend that should have been warnings. On the first night, he jokingly pointed me out to a group of strangers shouting, "This is my girlfriend, Claire. She's the designated worrier for the weekend, so if you lose your wallet, she's your gal." Everyone laughed, and I forced a tight smile, feeling my cheeks burn. Later, when I mentioned I was tired and wanted to head back to our tent, he rolled his eyes dramatically. "Seriously? The headliner hasn't even started. Don't be so boring." Sarah had smirked, a quick, knowing look passing between her and Matt. I stayed, of course, swaying on my feet with exhaustion while they danced, feeling more like an accessory than a partner. The drive back was the culmination of it all. We were all crammed into Matt's aging sedan, the seats sticky with spilled soda and the floor littered with crushed chip bags. The air was thick and stuffy, smelling of sweat and the cheap pine tree air freshener Matt insisted on hanging from the rearview mirror. He was driving, recounting a story from the festival's final night, a long, rambling tale that involved him and Kevin climbing a sound tower. His voice was loud, booming over the thumping bass of the stereo, and he kept glancing at his friends in the back for affirmation. Kevin, sitting next to me, was a loyal hype man, punctuating the story with shouts of, "No way, dude!" and "That's epic!" Sarah, on my other side, was filming snippets on her phone, a vacant smile on her face. I was wedged between them, my head pressed against the cool glass of the window. A relentless, pounding headache had taken root behind my eyes hours ago, a product of dehydration, lack of sleep, and the constant, overwhelming noise. Every beat of the bass felt like a hammer blow against my skull. All I wanted was quiet. All I wanted was to be home, in my own bed, away from the performance of it. Can you please turn it down a little, Matt?" I asked, leaning forward into the small space between the front seats. My voice was quieter than I intended, easily swallowed by the music. He didn't hear me. I tried again, louder this time. "Matt, can you turn the music down, please?" He glanced up at the rearview mirror, his smile faltering for a second. Irritation flickered in his eyes. "What's wrong, Claire? Can't handle a little fun? We're celebrating an awesome weekend." "I just have a headache," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I hated the feeling of having to justify my own discomfort. "It's really loud. Always something with you, isn't there?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. He sighed dramatically, a put-upon sound meant for his audience, and slapped at the volume knob, turning it down 2 notches. It was a token gesture, barely making a difference, but it was clear that was all I was going to get. Kevin snickered from beside me. "She's in library mode," he said to Matt, and they both chuckled. I shrank back into my seat, the familiar heat of shame rising in my chest. I was the buzzkill, the party pooper, the librarian. It was a role I was often assigned in Matt's world, the quiet, sensible counterpoint that made his own carefree attitude seem all the more exciting. For years, I had accepted it. I told myself that relationships were about balance, that my quiet nature complemented his boisterous one. But in that moment, squeezed between his two smirking friends, it didn't feel like balance. It felt like I was being perpetually cast as the before picture in his afterlife of fun. An hour later, the gaslight blinked on. A welcome reprieve. Matt pulled off the interstate and into a brightly lit but utterly deserted-looking gas station. It was one of those lonely outposts of civilization, a single structure surrounded by dark, empty fields. "All right, last stop. Anyone need anything?" he announced, killing the engine. The sudden silence was a blessing. "I'm going to grab some water and chips," I said, my voice raspy. I was already unbuckling my seatbelt, desperate to escape the confines of the car. My legs were stiff, my head was still throbbing, and a little fresh air felt like a lifeline. "Hurry up," Matt said, his eyes already glued to his phone screen. He didn't look at me. "We're losing time." As I opened the door, I saw Sarah give Matt a quick, subtle nod. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was too focused on the simple mission of getting water and escaping the headache. I walked into the small convenience store. The air was cool and smelled of cleaning fluid and old coffee. The cashier, a tired-looking man with a graying beard and a stained uniform, barely glanced up from the crossword puzzle spread on the counter. The silence in the store was profound, broken only by the low hum of the drink coolers. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive noise of the car. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle over me. I took my time, walking slowly down the aisle, enjoying the simple freedom of being alone. I picked out a large bottle of water and a small bag of pretzels, savoring the feeling of making a decision, no matter how small, that was entirely my own. I paid in cash, tucking the change into my pocket, and walked back towards the door. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the car was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mind didn't process it at first. I blinked, expecting my eyes to adjust and see the familiar shape of his dark blue sedan parked by another pump. But there was nothing. The space where it had been was starkly, shockingly empty. The only other vehicles in the lot were a massive semi-truck parked at the far end, its engine rumbling softly, and the cashier's beat-up sedan near the door. My first thought was that he was playing a trick, a stupid, childish prank. He'd moved the car around the side of the building to make me panic for a second. Irritation prickled at me. Of course, this was exactly his sense of humor. I walked around the building, my footsteps echoing in the unsettling quiet. The back of the building was dark and empty. No car. I looked down the long, dark stretch of the on-ramp leading back to the interstate, hoping to see his headlights. Nothing. Just an empty ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the blackness. The irritation began to curdle into a cold, heavy dread in the pit of my stomach. This was longer than a joke. This felt different. I pulled out my phone, my fingers feeling clumsy and slow. I called him. The phone, my heart started to beat faster. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text, my thumbs shaking. "Where are you? This isn't funny. Come back." The little delivered receipt appeared, but it didn't turn to read. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes, the plastic bag with my water and pretzels crinkling in my clenched fist. The initial confusion had burned away, leaving behind a raw, sickening realization. He hadn't just moved the car. He hadn't just pulled a prank. He had left. He had gotten back on the interstate and driven away, leaving me here. The nod Sarah had given him flashed in my mind. They were in on it. They had all been in on it. Knee rang once, twice, then clicked, straight to voicemail. "Hey, you've reached Matt. You know what to do." I could almost hear their laughter now, echoing down the highway as they sped away from the punchline they'd abandoned. I pictured them filming it, their phones pointed at the empty spot where I was supposed to be, capturing the moment for a story they would tell for weeks. The story of the girl who nagged too much and got left behind. It was hilarious. It was just a joke. But as I stood there, alone in the vast, indifferent darkness of the countryside, with nothing but the hum of the gas station coolers for company, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a verdict. It felt like they were showing me, in the cruelest way possible, exactly what I was worth to them, and the answer was nothing at all. I was disposable. The thought didn't just hurt, it hollowed me out completely. The gas station was an island of harsh, artificial light in an ocean of darkness. The fluorescent lamps overhead hummed with an insistent, buzzing sound that seemed to amplify the silence. Beyond the pool of light they cast on the cracked asphalt, there was nothing but the impenetrable black of the countryside. The world felt like it had shrunk to this single, lonely spot, and I was its only inhabitant. The cool night air, which had felt refreshing just minutes before, now felt predatory. It seeped through the thin fabric of my jacket, raising goosebumps on my arms and making me shiver uncontrollably. Fear was no longer a thought. It was a physical presence, a knot of ice tightening in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I was over 100 miles from home. I had $4 and some loose change in my pocket, and my phone, my only link to anyone or anything, was flashing a grim red warning, 10% battery remaining. I tried calling Matt one more time, a desperate, foolish act of hope. Straight to voicemail. I called Sarah. It rang and rang, then went to her cheerful sing-song voicemail message. I called Kevin. He didn't even have voicemail set up. A cold, robotic voice informed me that the person I was trying to reach was unavailable. They were either ignoring my calls or had turned their phones off. The thought was a fresh wave of betrayal. It was one thing to play a cruel prank. It was another thing entirely to cut someone off completely, leaving them vulnerable, alone and with no way to get help. It was negligent. It was dangerous. My breath started coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked around wildly. The semi-truck was still there, its engine a low, menacing rumble. The thought of approaching it, of asking a stranger for help, sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. Every horror story my mother had ever told me about women alone at night flooded my mind. I was a target. I was exposed. Forcing my legs to move, I walked back into the sterile brightness of the store. The cashier looked up, and his expression shifted from detached boredom to active suspicion. His eyes raked over me, taking in my festival-worn clothes and my pale, frightened face. "Everything all right, miss?" he asked, his tone flat and unwelcoming. My friends left me here," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. Admitting it out loud made it horribly real. "I think they think it's a joke, but they're not answering their phones." He grunted, a sound devoid of any sympathy. He'd probably heard 1,000 stories in this place, and mine was just one more inconvenience. "Well, you can't stay in here all night. We ain't a shelter." "No, of course not," I said quickly, feeling like a nuisance. "Is there a bus station nearby? Or a taxi service? Anything?" My voice was small, pleading. He gestured, vaguely with the end of his pen towards the dark road outside. "There's a bus that stops in town, St. Clairsville. It's about 3 miles down that road." He paused, looking at me. "But it ain't running again till 6 in the morning. A taxi might come out this far, but it'll cost you a lot. 3 miles, down a dark, unlit country road in the middle of the night." The knot of fear in my chest coiled so tight it felt like it would snap. He saw the look on my face and shrugged, as if to say, "Not my problem." He turned his attention back to his crossword puzzle, a clear dismissal. I was on my own. I looked at my phone. 8%. Each percentage point felt like a grain of sand in an hourglass that was running out too fast. I needed to use it wisely. "Sir?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Could I please charge my phone for just a few minutes? There's an outlet right there. I just need to look something up." He eyed me for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze sharp and untrusting. I held my breath. Finally, with a put-upon sigh, he nodded towards an outlet behind a dusty rack of off-brand potato chips. 10 minutes, and stay where I can see you. Thank you, I whispered, relief washing over me so intensely my knees felt weak. I fumbled in my purse for my charging cord and plugged the phone in. The screen lit up, and I watched the little battery icon, willing it to fill. As the phone came back to life, a string of notifications popped up. My heart leaped, thinking one might be from Matt, an apology, an explanation, but they were all from social media. One notification stood out. Kevin posted for the first time in a while. My heart pounded against my ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. With a shaking finger, I tapped on it. It was a video, filmed from the passenger seat of Matt's car. The quality was terrible, shaky and dark, but the audio was perfectly clear. I could hear their voices, amplified and distorted. I could hear Matt's loud, obnoxious laugh, a sound I used to think was full of joy. Now it just sounded cruel. The camera panned across their faces, all of them grinning, hyped up on the thrill of their own mean-spiritedness. Then, it swung around to film the road stretching out behind them. In the far distance, I could see a bright, shrinking cluster of lights. My gas station. Then I saw the caption. It was from Matt, but he'd posted it from Kevin's account. A cowardly move to create distance. Bet she learned not to nag. Operation Teach a Lesson is a success. My breath hitched in my throat. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent gasp. My entire body went cold. A deep, cellular chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It wasn't just a spontaneous, stupid prank. It was premeditated. They had a name for it. Operation Teach a Lesson. They had planned this. They had discussed it amongst themselves, decided on my punishment for the crime of having a headache, and executed it with glee. My thumb, acting of its own accord, scrolled down. The comments were already a flood of digital laughter. LOL, you guys are savage. From someone I vaguely knew from one of Matt's classes. This is the funniest thing I've seen all day. From a high school acquaintance. Did you really just leave her there? Followed by a string of 5 crying, laughing emojis. Then, a comment that felt like a physical blow. It was from a mutual friend, Emily, someone I'd had coffee with just last week, someone I'd confided in about my occasional frustrations with Matt. Don't worry, Claire. He'll come back for you. Eventually. LMAO. You know how he is. The betrayal was no longer a general feeling. It was specific and sharp, 1,000 tiny cuts. They weren't just laughing at me. They were participating. They were broadcasting my fear and humiliation for entertainment, turning my very real panic into a piece of shareable content. They had taken my most vulnerable moment and passed it around for likes. A single tear burned a hot track down my cold cheek, but I wiped it away with a furious, angry motion. This wasn't sadness anymore. It was something else, something harder and colder and sharper. As I stood there in that dusty corner of a forgotten gas station, watching a video of the people who were supposed to be my friends, my partner, laughing at my expense, I realized that the fear of being alone was gone. It had been burned away by the white-hot fire of my rage. It was replaced by the terrifying, clarifying certainty that I already was alone, and I had been for a very long time, even when they were sitting right next to me. 10 minutes are up. The cashier's voice cut through my daze. It was flat, impatient. I flinched, pulling the plug from the wall as if it had burned me. I shoved my phone and charger into my purse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. The phone was at 22%, a tiny, precious sliver of connection to a world I no longer wanted any part of. I muttered a thank you to the cashier, who just grunted in response, his eyes already back on his puzzle. I walked back outside, my legs feeling stiff and robotic. I sat down hard on the cold concrete. Curb, the rough surface biting through my thin jeans. The video played on a loop in my mind. Their laughing faces, the shrinking lights of the gas station, that stupid, triumphant emoji, Operation Teach a Lesson. The name itself was a special kind of cruelty, positioning them as the teachers and me as the unruly student who needed to be disciplined. For what? For having a headache? For being tired? For not conforming to the exact brand of fun they demanded? My first instinct, the one that had been conditioned into me over 3 years, with Matt, was to fight back, to use that 22% of battery to unleash a torrent of rage, to text him, to text all of them, and tell them exactly what I thought of them, to call them cruel, pathetic, dangerous. I wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt me. My thumb hovered over his contact photo, a smiling picture of us on a beach vacation last year. I looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy. But I remembered that day. I remembered he'd spent the first hour complaining because I wanted to read my book under an umbrella instead of joining his epic game of beach volleyball. I'd eventually given in, just to make him happy, and had spent the rest of the day with a sunburn and a fake smile plastered on my face. My smile in that picture was the same smile I put on when he called me a buzzkill in front of his friends. It was the same smile I wore when he made jokes at my expense, assuring me I was being too sensitive. It was the same smile I had when he accidentally forgot to invite me out, only to post pictures of his wild night on Instagram. It was the smile of appeasement. It was the smile of a girl who was so terrified of being difficult that she had slowly, piece by piece, sanded down her own edges until she was smooth, agreeable, and easy to handle. Sitting on that curb, the sharp smell of gasoline hanging in the air, I saw that smile for what it was, a cage, and I was tired of living in it. What was I trying to get back to anyway? What was the goal of that angry, pleading text message? To get them to turn the car around? To be allowed back into that cramped, toxic space? To sit in silence for the rest of the ride home while they either ignored me or condescendingly told me it was just a joke? And then what? To go back to our apartment and pretend this never happened? To wait for the next lesson? The thought was revolting. Begging to be let back into that car, into that life, was the worst possible outcome I could imagine. It would be the ultimate confirmation of their power over me. It would prove their lesson had been a success. Something inside me didn't just break. It hardened. It solidified into a single, unshakable resolution. I wasn't going to call them. I wasn't going to text them. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a tearful, hysterical phone call that they could put on speaker for everyone's amusement. I would not perform the role of the hysterical girlfriend. I would not give them a single word. I would not participate in my own humiliation. My silence would be my answer. It was the only weapon I had left. With a strange sense of calm, I opened my phone and went to his contact. My finger trembled slightly as I pressed the block button. A confirmation message popped up. "Are you sure you want to block this contact?" I pressed it without a flicker of hesitation. A small, profound sense of relief washed over me. Then, I went to Sarah's contact. Block, Kevin's, block. I scrolled through the comments on the video, blocking every single person who had left a laughing emoji or a thoughtless joke. One by one, I built a digital wall. It felt like cleansing a wound, like methodically removing dozens of tiny infected splinters from my skin. With the last of my battery, I opened a browser and looked up the number for the taxi company the cashier had mentioned. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. I told him where I was, my voice surprisingly steady. He quoted me a price to get to the bus station in the next major town over, a figure that was more than all the money I had in my bank account. I didn't care. "I'll be waiting," I said, and hung up. Then my phone died for good, the screen going black, plunging me into a profound and terrifying silence. For the next 45 minutes as I waited for the taxi, I just sat there, watching the headlights of passing trucks paint long, lonely streaks across the dark highway. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Matt. I was waiting for myself. The taxi finally arrived, a dusty old sedan that smelled of cigarette smoke. The driver barely looked at me as I climbed into the back seat. The journey back was a blur of dark roads and sleeping towns. I bought a one-way bus ticket with my emergency credit card and found a seat by the window. As the bus rumbled through the pre-dawn darkness, I watched my own reflection in the glass, a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the passing landscape. I didn't cry. I felt strangely empty, hollowed out, but also calm. The decision had been made. When I finally walked into the apartment I shared with Matt, it was just after sunrise. The place was quiet and still. His shoes were kicked off by the door, and his jacket was thrown over a chair. A half-eaten pizza sat on the coffee table. It looked exactly the same as it always did, but it felt completely alien. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a stage set for a life I was no longer willing to perform in. Moving with a quiet efficiency I didn't know I possessed, I went to our bedroom and pulled an old duffel bag from the back of the closet. I packed only what was mine, what I had paid for with my own money, my clothes, my textbooks, my laptop, my toiletries. I didn't take anything he had ever given me. I left the framed photos on the nightstand, the jewelry in the box on the dresser, the little trinkets that were supposed to symbolize our shared life. They were just props, and the play was over. Within an hour, I was standing by the door, duffel, bag in one hand, backpack on my shoulder. I took one last look around the apartment. I felt no sadness, no nostalgia, just a vast, empty relief. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a final, angry text. I just opened the door, closed it softly behind me, and disappeared into the morning light. I chose silence. I chose myself. The first few months were a masterclass in survival. The quiet resolve I'd felt in the apartment quickly evaporated under the harsh reality of being truly, utterly alone. I moved into a tiny, run-down room I'd found on a crumpled flyer, in a house shared with 3 strangers. The room smelled of dust and damp, and my bed was an air mattress that was always half deflated by morning. The silence I had chosen as a weapon now felt like a punishment. Loneliness was a physical ache, a constant, heavy presence in the room with me. I had cut off not just Matt and his inner circle, but my entire social life, because it had all been woven together with him at the center. My phone never rang. My weekends were vast, empty deserts of time. I would sometimes walk through crowded public places just to feel the presence of other people, to remind myself that the world was still turning. I was broke, dangerously broke. The little money I had in my account was vaporized by the security deposit and first month's rent on my sad little room. My part-time job at a campus bookstore, which had been enough for pocket money when my expenses were shared with Matt, was now a cruel joke against the reality of rent, utilities, and groceries in a city that wasn't cheap. So, I took on more work. Then, I took on more work still. My life became a relentless, grinding cycle of exhaustion. My alarm would go off at 4:30 a.m., piercing the dark. I'd pull on the black apron for my opening shift at a campus coffee shop, the smell of burnt espresso and steamed milk clinging to my clothes and hair all day. I'd serve smiling, caffeinated students, my own smile feeling like a mask I could barely keep in place. After my shift, I'd rush to my university classes, collapsing into a seat in the back of a lecture hall, a notebook open in front of me, trying desperately to absorb information about political theory while my body screamed for sleep. In the evenings, I worked as a waitress at a greasy 24-hour diner where my feet throbbed on the sticky linoleum floor and my apron was perpetually stained with ketchup and coffee. I'd get home well after midnight, the smell of fried food, clinging to me, and force myself to study for a few hours until the words on the page started to blur. Then I'd fall into a dead sleep for 3 or 4 hours and do it all over again. The pain from that night at the gas station didn't just go away. It lingered, a dull throb beneath the surface of my exhaustion, but it also began to change. It transmuted into something else. It became fuel. Every time I wanted to quit, every time I felt a wave of self-pity wash over me as I ate instant noodles for the 4th night in a row, I would see that stupid, laughing emoji from Matt's post. I would hear their laughter in my head, echoing in the quiet of my room. They had left me with nothing, assuming I was helpless, assuming I would come crawling back, broken and begging for forgiveness. The thought of proving them wrong became my singular, burning obsession. Survival was no longer the goal. I needed to build a life so solid, so successful, so completely and utterly my own, that no one could ever have the power to shake it again, let alone dismantle it. I became ruthlessly frugal. I scraped and saved every single dollar. I learned to cut my own hair from online tutorials. I mended my clothes until they were more patches than original fabric. I stopped going out completely. My life was stripped down to its barest essentials: work, school, and sleep. There was a brutal simplicity to it, a monastic devotion to my own resurrection. I was forging a new person in the fires of that hardship. The timid, eager-to-please girl Matt had left at that gas station was burning away day by day, and in her place, someone tougher, sharper, and more resilient was being formed. The real turning point came when I started studying for the LSATs, the law school admission test. I'd always been a good student, and a professor had once casually mentioned I had a good mind for law. On a whim, I bought a used prep book. The logic puzzles and dense analytical reading passages were a sanctuary. They were structured, rational, and blessedly fair. There were rules. There was a right answer you could arrive at through reason and evidence. It was the complete opposite of the chaotic, emotionally manipulative world that had hurt me so badly. Law became my new language, a system where I could fight back not with tears or anger, but with precedent, logic, and precisely worded arguments. It was a language of power, and I was determined to become fluent. Getting my acceptance letter to a good law school felt like the first real victory, the first undeniable proof that I was more than just the punchline to someone else's cruel joke. The letter shook in my hands as I read it, and for the first time in over a year, I cried. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of overwhelming cathartic relief. Law school was even more brutal than my undergrad grind. The competition was fierce. The workload was crushing, and I was still juggling part-time jobs to avoid taking on crippling debt. But for the first time since that night, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was surrounded by sharp, ambitious people. My professors were demanding but brilliant. I felt my mind expanding, growing stronger every day. I thrived on the intellectual challenge. Each good grade, each successful mock trial, each word of praise from a professor was another brick I laid in the foundation of my new life. I graduated with honors. I passed the bar exam on my first try. After a series of grueling interviews, I landed a prestigious clerkship with a well-respected federal judge, a position coveted by graduates from top-tier schools. Each achievement was a silent, defiant roar back into the void that had threatened to swallow me whole. I wasn't just climbing back, I was building a fortress, stone by painstaking stone. And from the high walls of that fortress, the memory of Matt and his laughing friends, once a towering monster, now looked very, very small. They thought they had left me stranded in the middle of nowhere. They had no idea they had actually dropped me off at the starting line of a race they could never hope to win. The 5 years that followed my disappearance were a blur of relentless forward motion. My world was a fortress built of law books, case studies, and the quiet, humming fluorescent lights of the library. I didn't have time to look back, and more importantly, I didn't have the desire. The life I'd shared with Matt felt like a story that had happened to someone else, a poorly written prequel I had no interest in rereading. But the past has a way of sending out ripples. I had meticulously blocked every digital pathway back to my old life, but the world is smaller than we think. Whispers and rumors found their way to me through the cracks, delivered by old acquaintances I couldn't avoid running into or through. The public, unavoidable nature of social media profiles I'd stumble upon by accident. The first piece of news came about a year after I'd left. I was in a crowded coffee shop, cramming for a particularly brutal contracts exam, when a girl from one of my undergrad sociology classes spotted me. Her name was Jessica. We'd never been close, but we were friendly enough. Her face lit up with a sort of gossipy excitement. "Claire Thompson! Oh my God, I haven't seen you in forever. You totally fell off the face of the earth." I gave her a small, polite smile, hoping to keep the interaction brief. "Yeah, I've been really busy with my new program." "Oh, right. Someone said you were going to law school. That's amazing," she said. Then her voice dropped conspiratorially. "So, are you still with Matt? I heard you guys had this crazy breakup." My stomach tightened. "No, we're not together," I said, my tone flat and final. "Probably for the best," she said, leaning closer. "He's kind of a mess now. Did you hear he dropped out? He was only 2 semesters away from graduating, but he just stopped going. Kevin told my roommate that Matt was partying way too much. Said he needed to live a little before getting tied down to a real job." She rolled her eyes. "I guess living a little means working part-time at a sneaker store in the mall." I just nodded, offering nothing. I didn't want to be a part of this conversation, but the information settled in my mind like a fine dust. Dropped out. The Matt I knew had always been obsessed with projecting an image of success, even if he didn't want to do the work. Graduating had been a cornerstone of that image. The idea of him abandoning it suggested that the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Another year passed. The second piece of news came from a more impersonal source. I was doing research for a paper and had fallen down a rabbit hole of social media links. I ended up on the profile of a vaguely familiar name and saw a tagged photo from a party. And there was Matt. He looked different. His face was puffy, and there was a frantic, almost desperate energy in his smile. He was holding a red plastic cup aloft, the center of a small, unenthusiastic-looking group. The caption read, "Another wild one with the king." But the photo told a different story. It looked less like a celebration and more like a sad attempt to recapture a glory that had already faded. I clicked on his profile. It was public. The bio still read, "Living the dream." But the posts were sporadic and mostly throwback pictures from college, from the festival, from a time when his brand of reckless charm had a willing audience. His more recent posts were blurry photos from dive bars, complaints about his job, and a few aggressive, vaguely political rants that seemed wildly out of character. He'd lost the job at the sneaker store. Then he'd lost a job as a barback. According to a bitter post from 6 months prior, he'd been fired for being too awesome for them to handle. The most telling thing, however, was his friend list. It was shrinking. Kevin and Sarah were still there, but many of the names and faces from our college days had vanished. People were moving on, graduating, getting jobs, getting married. They were building lives. Matt, it seemed, was stuck, endlessly trying to relive the one weekend where he felt like a king. The weekend he'd left me at a gas station. The third and most vivid report came during my final year of law school. I ran into Emily at a grocery store, the mutual friend who had left that laughing comment on Kevin's video. She saw me in the cereal aisle and froze, her face draining of color. For a moment, I thought she would turn and walk the other way, but instead, she approached me cautiously, her expression full of a shame that was 3 years too late. "Claire," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Wow, you look amazing." "I'm doing well, thank you," I said, my voice polite but cool. I had no interest in forgiving her, but I also had no energy for a confrontation. She was a ghost and I didn't want to give her any power. "Look," she rushed to say, wringing her hands. "I know it's way too late, but I am so sorry. About that night. About what I said. It was a horrible thing to do. We were all stupid and drunk, and we were following Matt's lead. That's no excuse, but it's the truth." I just looked at her, my expression unreadable. "He's not a good person, Claire," she continued, as if I needed the confirmation. "It took us all way too long to see it. The jokes just kept getting meaner, you know? After you left, he got worse. His drinking got really bad. He became bitter. He was always angry that you just disappeared. He told everyone you were crazy, that you'd overreacted. But then, when he tried to date other girls, he'd pull the same kinds of stunts, and they wouldn't put up with it for a second. He alienated everyone." She took a shaky breath. "Kevin and Sarah don't even talk to him anymore. They had a huge falling out about 6 months ago. He borrowed a bunch of money from Kevin and never paid him back. And he tried to make a move on Sarah while she was dating someone else. It was a huge, ugly scene. They finally realized he wasn't a fun-loving party guy. He was just a user, and he was dragging everyone down with him." I listened to her story with a strange sense of detachment. There was no pleasure in hearing it, no triumphant feeling of vindication. It was just sad. It was the predictable, pathetic trajectory of a bully who had run out of victims. He hadn't crumbled because of some cosmic justice. He had crumbled because he was hollow. His entire personality had been built on the attention and reactions of others. When I, and then everyone else, had stopped playing our parts, there was nothing left to hold him up. As I walked away from Emily, leaving her standing in the brightly lit aisle, I realized that I hadn't thought about Matt as a person in years. He was just a catalyst, the faceless villain in my origin story. Hearing about his slow, messy decline didn't bring me joy. It brought me a profound sense of closure. His life hadn't been ruined by my success. It had been ruined by his own character, and my life had been saved by it. 5 years to the day. The thought occurred to me as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse. 5 years since I had sat on a cold bus, my entire life packed into a duffel bag, watching the sun rise over a future that felt like a terrifying blank page. Now, that page was filled. The courthouse had become my second home. Its quiet, cavernous halls, the smell of old paper and floor polish, the weight of the law that seemed to seep from its marble walls. It was all a part of the life I had built, brick by painstaking brick. I had just finished a grueling 3-day hearing, assisting the judge I clerked for, the Honorable David McMillan. It was a complex corporate case, and I had been running on caffeine and adrenaline for a week straight. My shoulders ached, my eyes were tired, but I felt a deep, satisfying hum of accomplishment. We had prevailed on a key motion, and my research had been instrumental. The work was demanding, but it was meaningful. It was real. As I walked out into the grand rotunda, Judge McMillan fell into step beside me. He was a formidable man with a sharp mind and a surprisingly kind demeanor, and he had become a mentor to me over the past year. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder, his expression warm. "You did excellent work in there, Counselor Thompson," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Your brief on the jurisdictional issue was flawless. You have a bright future ahead of you." A genuine smile spread across my face, a smile that reached my tired eyes. "Thank you, Judge. That means a lot." His praise was worth more to me than any validation I had ever sought in my past life. It was earned. It was real. It was in that moment, bathed in the afternoon light streaming through the high-arched windows, feeling the weight of the judges. Respect that I heard it. A voice from a past I had buried. "Claire?" The voice was hesitant, uncertain. It was thinner than I remembered, stripped of its usual bravado, but it was unmistakably his. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. For a split second, my mind refused to connect the sound to the present moment. It was like a ghost whispering in a place it didn't belong. Slowly, I turned, and there he was, Matt. The 5 years had not been kind to him. The boyish charm that had once been his greatest asset had curdled into something weary and defeated. He was thinner, but not in a healthy way. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights or hard living. He was wearing a suit, but it was cheap and ill-fitting, the jacket pulling awkwardly across his shoulders and the pants a little too short. It looked like a costume he had borrowed for an occasion he wasn't prepared for. His hair was messy, and he looked profoundly, utterly lost. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, but his eyes weren't just on me. They were darting from my face to the distinguished gray-haired man standing beside me, the man whose hand was still resting on my shoulder. He saw my own tailored suit, the leather briefcase in my hand, the look of easy, professional camaraderie I shared with the judge. He was taking in the entire picture, and I could see the frantic calculations happening behind his eyes as his brain tried to reconcile the girl he'd left at a gas station with the woman standing before him. He took a half-step forward, a desperate, ingratiating smile forming on his lips. "Claire! Wow, it's been so long. You look," he trailed off, unable to find the right word. But I knew what he was seeing. He wasn't seeing the girl who needed his approval, the girl who would have once been thrilled by his attention. He was seeing a stranger, a powerful, confident woman in a world he didn't have access to. Judge McMillan, sensing my stillness, looked from me to Matt, his expression shifting to one of polite inquiry. He didn't know our history. To him, Matt was just a stranger who had recognized his clerk. He gave me a questioning look, and I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head. The judge, ever perceptive, seemed to understand. He gave my shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze. "Great work today, Counselor Thompson," he said again, his voice clear and firm, deliberately using my professional title. He gave Matt a brief, dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a tourist who has wandered into the wrong room, and then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The words, "Counselor Thompson," hung in the air between us. Matt froze. The fake smile dissolved from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at me, then at the retreating back of the judge, and then back at me. The pieces clicked into place. The suit, the briefcase, the courthouse, the judge. He finally understood. He hadn't just run into his ex-girlfriend. He had stumbled into a life he couldn't have even imagined for me. A world where I held a power and a status that dwarfed anything he had ever achieved. The joke, the one he had been dining out on for years, had suddenly, irrevocably, turned on him. And in the cavernous, silent rotunda of the federal courthouse, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The world seemed to slow down. The ambient sounds of the courthouse, the distant ringing of a phone, the soft murmur of conversations, the echo of footsteps on marble, all faded into a dull, distant hum. The vast space of the rotunda had shrunk to the 10 feet of air that separated me from Matt. He was still frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin with a pasty, unhealthy pallor. He stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Counselor? You're a lawyer?" The question was so absurd, so revealing of the tiny box he had always kept me in, that I almost laughed. The idea of me, Claire, the quiet, agreeable, nagging girlfriend, achieving something so significant was clearly beyond his comprehension. He was looking at me as if I had sprouted wings. He tried again, forcing that pathetic, ingratiating smile back onto his face. It was a ghastly sight, a desperate attempt to regain some sort of footing on ground that was rapidly crumbling beneath him. "Claire, wow, I mean, that's incredible. I had no idea. We should catch up, grab a coffee sometime. I'd love to hear all about it." His words were a pathetic lifeline thrown across a chasm. He was trying to rewind time, to reposition himself as an old friend, a supporter, someone who had a right to be a part of this new, impressive life I had built. He was trying to pretend that the last 5 years, and the night that started them, had never happened. In the past, I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In my loneliest, angriest nights during that first year, I had scripted this scene, with fiery, vengeful dialogue. I had imagined myself listing my accomplishments like weapons, detailing his failures with surgical precision, and finally, cathartically, telling him how much he had hurt me and how much I despised him. I had fantasized about making him feel as small and worthless as he had made me feel that night. But standing there, looking at the diminished man before me, I felt none of that. The anger was gone, burned away long ago and transformed into the fuel that had built this life. The desire for revenge felt like a childish impulse, a waste of precious energy. Yelling at him, insulting him, even acknowledging the past would, in a strange way, be a gift. It would validate his importance. It would confirm that he still held a space in my mind, that his actions still had the power to provoke a reaction from me. It would reestablish a connection, no matter how toxic, between us. And I had no intention of doing that. So I said nothing. I simply stood there and looked at him. I didn't glare. I didn't smirk. I didn't show any anger or pain or triumph. My expression was calm, neutral, and utterly, profoundly indifferent. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has asked you for directions in a city you're about to leave. My silence was not an absence of words. It was a statement. It was a solid, impenetrable wall. It said, "You do not matter. Your opinion does not matter. Your shock does not matter. You are so irrelevant to my life now that you do not even warrant a response." His smile faltered, then collapsed completely under the weight of my silence. A flicker of panic entered his eyes. He had expected tears, or anger, or accusations. He was prepared for a scene. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for nothing. My indifference was in language he didn't understand, and it terrified him. "Claire, come on," he said, his voice taking on a pleading edge. "Don't be like this. It was a long time ago. We were kids. It was just a stupid joke." He had finally said it. The pathetic, cowardly excuse he had hidden behind for 5 years. A stupid joke. And still, I said nothing. I just held his gaze. I let him see the woman I had become. I let him see that his words, his excuses, had no power here. They were pebbles, thrown against the thick stone walls of my fortress, making no sound, leaving no mark. The silence stretched on, growing heavier and more awkward with each passing second. He started to fidget, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, running a hand through his messy hair. He looked around the rotunda as if hoping someone would come and rescue him from this excruciating moment. But no one did. He was completely, utterly alone in his shame. The dawning realization of what was happening finally washed over him. He wasn't just being snubbed by an ex-girlfriend. He was being dismissed by a person of consequence. His prank, his lesson, hadn't taught me anything. It had only revealed his own profound inadequacy. In trying to make me feel small, he had only succeeded in shrinking himself. I watched as the last bit of bluster drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man in a cheap suit. He finally broke eye contact, his gaze dropping to the polished marble floor. The silence had done what no amount of shouting ever could. It had spoken the truth. It had judged him, and it had found him wanting. My calm, steady, quiet power was louder than any scream I could have ever uttered. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute, I gave him one last, final look. It was a look without hatred, without pity, without any emotion at all. It was a look of dismissal. Then, I turned my back on him. I didn't rush. My movements were calm and deliberate. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase on my shoulder, and I started walking towards the large arched doorway that led out into the afternoon sun. Each step was solid, my heels clicking with a steady, even rhythm on the marble floor. I didn't look back. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was still standing there, watching me go. I could feel his gaze on my back, but it had no weight. It was like the weak winter sun, present, but with no warmth and no power to burn. As I pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped outside, the city air hit me. It was cool and smelled of street food and exhaust fumes, the smell of life. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The tension I hadn't even realized I was holding in my shoulders released in a long, slow sigh. It was over. Not just the encounter, but the entire chapter of my life that he had defined. It was finally, completely, irrevocably over. I walked to my car, a modest but reliable sedan that I had bought with my own salary. I slid into the driver's seat and just sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The silence in the car was different from the silence in the courthouse. This was a peaceful silence. It was the quiet of my own space, a sanctuary I had built for myself. As I drove home, my mind was surprisingly calm. There was no triumphant replay of the scene, no gloating over his stunned expression. Instead, there was just a profound sense of peace, a quiet hum of closure that settled deep in my bones. For years, I had thought that closure would require an apology from him, a grand admission of his cruelty. I had believed I needed him to acknowledge what he had done in order for me to truly heal. I now understood how wrong I had been. Closure was not something he could give me. I had just given it to myself. It wasn't about him finally understanding the punchline of his own bad joke. It was about me realizing that the joke was never on me to begin with. The joke was a small, sad man whose only sense of power came from belittling others. The joke was on someone who had peaked at 21 and had spent the rest of his life trying to relive his glory days in a world that had long since moved on. I didn't insult him. I didn't need to bring up the gas station. My life was the response. My career, my peace of mind, my ability to stand in a federal courthouse and be addressed as counselor, that was my counter-argument. His punishment wasn't my success. It was his own stagnation. He had stayed exactly where he was, while I had walked away and built an entire world without him. When I got to my apartment, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was a clean, bright space filled with books and plants, a stark contrast to the miserable, dusty room where my new life had begun. It was a home, not just a place to sleep. I dropped my briefcase by the door, took off my jacket, and went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. As I stood by the window, sipping the hot tea and watching the evening sky turn from blue to orange, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't felt before. A weight I didn't even know I was still carrying had been lifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the traditional sense. I wasn't forgiving him for what he did. I was simply releasing him. I was releasing the hold his memory had on me, the space he had occupied in my story. He was no longer the villain. He was just a footnote. For the first time, he truly realized the joke had never been on me. It was on him. And the most beautiful part of it all was that I no longer cared enough to even laugh. My revenge wasn't loud or fiery. It was the quiet, steady peace of a life well lived, a life he could never touch. Again, I had my head high, and my heart was, at long last, completely and utterly free. If you've ever been laughed at, left behind, or made to feel small, remember, your silence and your success can be the sharpest and most satisfying reply. Don't waste your energy chasing those who mock you, or trying to explain your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Rise above them, build your own fortress, and if this story touched you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment where you're watching from, because your story matters too. Your climb back is worth telling.